Please stand for the gospel. The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Mark. Glory to you, Lord Christ. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. A large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who was suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. And she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhaging stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware of the power that had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" The disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing that what had happened to her, came in fear and was trembling and fell down before him and told the truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some of the people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But hearing what they had said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When he had come to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When they had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make such a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with them and went out to where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talamatha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was about 12 years of age. At this point, they were overcome by amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should tell this, and told them to give her something to eat. The gospel of the Lord. Praise be to you. Please be seated. I apologize, sometimes the reading on the page doesn't match the reading in my head. Well, today we have a long gospel reading, probably one of the longest outside of Holy Week. And it's a story about healing. Now, on the surface, it looks like Jesus is coming in to show his power about what he can do. The writers of the Gospels put that in so we would see what Jesus could do and recognize his divinity and his power. But I think this is a greater story. This story is something for all of us, because in here, there's layer upon layer upon layer of meaning. And we have a healing story. We have two healing stories. We have two healing stories about two totally different types of people. So this is a very, very broad message going on here. And it isn't just a healing. It is a restoration, a resurrection. And if we had a full hour to talk about this, we could go into the different meanings of the different words used in Greek and what the inference is back to the Old Testament, and we'd be here a while. I'd probably say, let's go out and get some burgers and come back. But as a whole, what's going on here is a story about fear and death. Perhaps some of the two things that plague humanity the most. The things that cause us anxiety and fear. And Jesus steps in to say, be calm, be at peace, you are healed. It's a story about death, because in this story you have two people. You have a lady that has been hemorrhaging and has had some type of blood disease for 12 years. And then you have a little girl who is ironically also 12 years old. Now there's a meaning behind that, because when the gospel writers wrote this, they were writing it to the Jewish community, and 12 is a pretty magical, not magical, but mystical number in the Jewish culture, the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 meaning the 12 disciples, 12 meaning the wholeness and completeness of God's creation and universe. So, lady bleeding for 12 years, child is 12 years old. A way of saying this is about all of God's community. And even with the two people themselves, you have a lady that is basically untouchable. She's run out of her money from taking care of her medical expenses and has no one to care for her. And in the Jewish culture, if you were bleeding, you were considered ritually unclean. You were not allowed to be in regular society. So this is a person who is on the margins of culture. And then you have somebody of opposite status. You have the president of the synagogue, which would kind of sort of be like the senior warden of the church. That's about what status level of this person had. And in a small Jewish community, it's like basically almost being the mayor. So you have the child of a person of status. So you have somebody of high status, you have somebody outside of status. And Jesus yet coming to say, 12 years, this is the completeness and fullness of the church. Both of them near death. The little child dies. The woman, when you look at the Greek and go into the meanings of that, the word is, she was at her, and they use the word eschaton, which in theology, it's also meaning the end times. So basically it was saying she was at her end time. She was close to death. Again, that thing that has plagued humanity forever, death. The opposite of resurrection and restoration. And Jesus stepping in to the middle of that. We were, this weekend, Ethan was visiting this weekend, and we were starting the Godfather series. I haven't seen it in a while, and Ethan has never seen it. Although there's so much cultural stuff woven into other movies and other genres that you can almost not have never seen The Godfather, and yet have seen it because it comes up in every other thing. So we watched the first one, and of course, Francis Ford Coppola, masterpiece movie maker. And the acting too is just, to see Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, in their 20s and 30s was like, wow. But the part that hit me the most is at the very end, when Michael Corleone becomes Don Corleone. And you have that scene where he's at the baptism of his nephew. I forgot her name. I actually wrote it down. Let's see. Connie, his sister Connie. And Connie is having her son baptized. And so they're in the church. And they're switching between Latin and English. But the Roman Catholic baptismal rite is about 99% of the Episcopal baptismal rite. They're pretty close. And they actually say the part, I think he says it in English, where the priest asks him, which, like in our baptismal covenant, it says the same thing. Do you renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness, the evil powers of this world which corrupt and destroy the creatures of God, and sinful desires that draw us away from the love of God? And he says yes, knowing at the exact same time he's saying yes to renouncing the spiritual forces of evil which corrupt the children of God. He's ordered a hit on all the head family members of the other crime families, and you see that in the movie. And just that dichotomy of what the church's job and role is, what Christ's job and role and example is, and then what's going on in the background with this looming death that's coming. And as I was watching that, I was thinking about this reading, because in this reading, Jesus moves into that place, that point of death, and steps right into it. I think if most people, if they're in an elevated status, in an elected status, in a royal status, most people probably are shielded by that. You have advisors and a staff and assistants to take care and you delegate that those duties to other people to handle. But not Jesus. Jesus goes straight into where the pain is. He goes straight into where the death is. And in our lives, we've experienced things like that. We've had times when we've lost family members to illness or to age or to automobile accidents. Or recently in Angelo, one of Liam's close friends was killed in a homicide. And so there are those times in our lives when you've had tragedy occur, and Jesus goes right to that place. He steps in and goes right to where the pain is. And I would probably say, if you were to ask that question today, if someone says, what's God's response to death? God's response to death is God with us. God's response to the entire world is to be present and stand up against that destructive power. And we hear that today in the Old Testament when Louise read the Wisdom of Solomon. God did not make death and does not delight in death. For he created all things so they might exist. The generous forces of the world are wholesome, and there is no destructive poison in them. For he created us for incorruption. Taking us back to that baptismal covenant, those things that seek the corruption of the world. God steps in and stops and heals that. And so we have that today in this gospel reading with these two ladies, which I would say are individuals historically, but represent the wholeness of God. Because an unclean woman hemorrhaging, an important daughter of an important man's daughter, and all of this, God stepping in and saying, this healing and resurrection and restoration is for all of humanity. And I think when we look at that through that lens and think, where are we in that? Sometimes we're on the outside fringes, sometimes we're right in the middle of it. But what does God call us to do? God calls us to go to that friend that's grieving. God calls us to go to that family member that needs attention, who is sick. God calls us to reach out to somebody that's on the outside and pull them back in. Because ultimately that's what this reading is about. It's about God stepping in and wrapping God's arms around humanity and pulling us back into God's self. So in one way, some people say this is a story about Jesus' divinity. It is. Some say it's a story about how Jesus heals, and it is. But it's a story about God saying, don't forget, when you were on the outside, I pulled you back in. Slight reference to the Mafia again. I had to throw that in. But today, when we leave, think about how you may reach out to those who are on the outer margins and pull them back into the love of God. Amen.